back with Cador and his parents. Back at the original location. A ton of O'Toodles later.
O'Toodles!
Shut up! Back in Nagorno-Karabakh.
What follows is a brief construction montage.
Late again. You are an idiot.
Limited time only.
Flashback.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up.
End of flashback. Soon after, montage.
Previously, yesterday, meanwhile,
Meanwhile,
at the Krusty Krab.
Meanwhile, at Leo's house.
Meanwhile, at the Eras Picture Studios.
Meanwhile, back in the lowlands.
Meanwhile, in Ulacity.
Meanwhile, at the palace of King Poseidon, ruler of the seven seas.
A few hours later. A few hours later.
A few hours later. A few hours later. A few hours later. A few moments 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 later.
A few moments later.
A few moments later. A few moments later. A few moments later.
A few moments later. A little longer than a few moments later. A few with a few moments later.
Moments later. Moments later.
Moments later.
Many moments later, many unbearable moments later.
More moments later.
A little later.
A little while later,
Later. Later.
Later.
later,
Later.
Later.
later,
Later.
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 Slater.
later, later.
Later.
Later that Wolfie is going to the Eras Pictures' house and Agent Santos and Agent Arcano were going to the work. Later, at the Peahead Market.
Later. In the void.
Later, after the United Kingdom collapsed.
Later still.
Later that evening.
Later that same days. Later that disco night party.
Happy friendiversary.
Later that same evening.
Later that day, later that night,
Later that night.
later that night.
More later work.
Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later.
Not much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
You get the idea.
Just then.
Just then.
Just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m.,
4 o'clock in the afternoon.
8:01 p.m.
Second later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
10 seconds later, 12 seconds later,
47 seconds later, 47 seconds later, a few seconds later, 1 minute later,
1 minute, 37 seconds later,
928 seconds later.
2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later,
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later,
15 minutes later.
15 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later,
A few minutes later.
a few minutes later, A little longer than a few minutes later.
2 minutes later.
30 minutes later.
80 minutes later.
Many, many minutes later.
Sometime later.
1 hour later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later.
1 hour later?
1 hour later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later.
As the moon.
2 hours later. 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 2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later.
3 hours later. 3 hours later.
A few days later.
3 hours later.
5 hours later.
Several hours of lighting jacks later. 3 minutes later, after Rosie arrived on the moon. 12 minutes later, after Doris fell asleep.
Dirt block! I look like a Minecraft dirt block!
346 minutes later.
365 days later.
6 hours later. 6 hours later.
6.5 hours later. 6.5 hours later.
6, 7.
7 hours later. 8 hours later. 8 hours later.
1 month later.
9 hours later.
10 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later.
Communication reset.
12 sleepless hours later.
Several song-filled hours later. Many hours later. Yeah.
Many hours of fun time later. Many chilly hours later. Many unbearable hours later. Many unbearable hours later. Oh.
Tomorrow for sure. 24 hours later. 24 hours later. Early the next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning.
The next.
The next morning. The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next day.
The next day. The next day.
The next day.
The next day. The next day. The next day.
The next day.
The next day in a parallel universe.
The following day. The following Thursday. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. Tomorrow.
Again.
The very next evening. The next evening. The next Christmas. 1 day later.
Day 2. 48 hours later. 2 days later. Day 3. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. Day 4.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later.
Several days later.
Several days later. Several long days later.
1 week later. 1 week later.
1 week later. 1 weekend of pampering later. 2 weeks later.
16 paranoia-filled days later. 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later. 4 to 6 weeks later.
Iron.
6 months later. 6 months later.
6 months later!
7 months later.
Several months later. Many months later.
Many months of making a new later. Many months of making a new studio later. Many months of making a new house later. Many months of making a new show later.
Oxygen, iron.
Yeah.
70 years later.
72 hours later. 75 years later.
1,000 years later. 2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
5 million years later. One entree later.
An eternity later. One eternity later.
Nitrogen, iron.
Opening night. A lot of boring math later. Many frame building attempts later.
Many attempts to fix the past later.
Many memories later.
Many tic-tacs later.
Many attempts to fix the glove balloon later.
Many secret patties later. Many toys later.
Many
Forks later.
many massacres later. So many swear words later.
One humongous meal later.
One semester later. One season later.
1 full hour of idiot music later.
8 semesters later. One debt to society later. One very long digestive tract later. One loading screen later.
1 Russian ballot later.
One little boost to the surface later.
One pathetic sob story later. One frozen wasteland later. One long angry line later. One beautiful Christmas morning later. One shift later.
One shift later.
One extremely annoying shift later. One winner later. One nap later. One operation later. One pair of pants later.
1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later.
2 idiots later.
I look like a Minecraft dirt block. I dyed my hair green to prove to you guys that I don't look like a dirt block.
7 really pointless wild goose chase later. 10 really horrible nightmares later. 20 jump scares later. 37 miles later.
82 kilometers later.
242 explosions later.
298 frozen patties later.
861 millenniums later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
Thousands of tears later.
2,000 centuries later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
3,000 whoop-whoos later.
5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later. Eventually. Several bad puns later.
Several bouquets later.
Even more boat building attempts later.
Even more dangerous glitches later.
Graduation day.
When they arrived at Potato City.
Epilogue. Epilogue. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.